What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Twink Revolution. I'm Sam.
And I'm Gian.
And we're here with a very special guest. We're here with Alex Holmstrom-Smith. She's a former labor organizer and aspiring labor lawyer, member of New York City DSA, and a contributor for New Politics. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, you recently wrote a critical review of a book by Sophie Lewis. It's sort of relatively recently out on Verso, right? Called Full Surrogacy Now, Feminism Against Family. What on earth is this? And why did you write a critical review of it?
Yeah. Well, it's a hard book to describe, honestly. It's kind of has a lot of different things in it and goes in all these different directions and is almost written in a kind of like literary stream of consciousness kind of style. So it's like, I mean, a little bit hard to kind of like, and sometimes, since I wrote my review, a lot of people have been like, you don't really understand the like genre that this book is. But, I did my best to understand what it says, and the reason I was interested in it is because I guess I had just saw a talk that she was giving about it, and I saw some that my friends were interested in it, and I read the description and I was like, that doesn't make sense to me based on like what I know about surrogacy, which, I wasn't any kind of like expert on surrogacy when I first started looking into this, but I did go to law school, and in law school, everyone has to read legal cases about surrogacy because they're sort of like the perfect edge cases for like, contract and family law, like what, basically we read them in like contract law as sort of issues of public policy, like when should courts refuse to enforce contracts because they think that they're like not good for public policy or not, or they're illegal, like in contradiction with some other law, for example, laws that prohibit the use of money to like induce someone to give up their kid for adoption, that kind of thing. So I just sort of felt like I didn't think the description sounded right to me. And also like my just general background, like I consider myself a Marxist. I went to grad school for sociology. And so I was studying, some things related to like commodification and how the state plays a role in like creating new markets in some kinds of products, And so to me, this just seemed like commercial surrogacy is like a way of commodifying like pregnancy and babies and childbirth and stuff like that. And so it just seemed like something that socialists should obviously be opposed to. So I was like, what? I don't understand this book. Like, why is she trying to sort of, rethink that, what I think is the kind of obvious socialist line on it. So, I read the book a couple times and, so she is very critical of the surrogacy industry and how it exists today. She talks a lot about the industry in India, which kind of blew up to be the global destination for a little while before they then turned around and banned it again. They like legalized it in 2002 and then banned it in like 2016 or 18, I think. But like, so she talks about, how it's like very exploitative, the working conditions are really bad. The workers there, they pretty much all are giving birth by cesarean section, which is, not medically necessary. It's just they would time it for their like international clients to be able to like, we're arranging our vacation and we want the baby to be born on this date, so like cut it out now, which is just like so outrageously not good for the woman's health, and there's like this racialized aspect of it where like I think the doctor who like runs one of these clinics was like showing off, sort of like pointing out how the babies are like pure European, even though they're coming from like Indian women's bodies, and it's just like, it's so, the whole like racial class, every dynamic of it is just like so deeply, deeply exploitative and like just appalling in so many ways. So she doesn't try to like sugarcoat that at all in the book, but she kind of takes this line that's like kind of borrowed from a lot of contemporary discourses around sex work, where she's just like, you can't make it illegal because it'll just force workers underground, and instead we should be just like trying to organize the workers. And the book has some various other things. She kind of goes into this discourse around like, what would it mean to have a strike in this kind of work, which is sort of like a lot of abortions.
Wow.
And then she kind of talks about, I don't know, there's a lot. She has this thing about abortion and how we have to sort of accept that it's actually killing. And I didn't really even get into that in my review. But yeah, I don't know. I think so that's sort of her line on like commercial surrogacy specifically. In terms of the other goals that she's trying to accomplish in the book, I think you could say like she is trying to say that the sort of some of the people who are like anti-surrogacy campaigners, including like the Catholic Church, for example, are kind of concerned about the way that surrogacy kind of like disrupts traditional like nuclear family models or whatever. And so she was sort of trying to say like, we should actually just embrace that. And I guess I think the other thing is that sometimes like when anti-surrogacy campaigners sort of talk about the labor of surrogacy and sort of what, the bodily nature of it, there's kind of this way that like we're supposed to sort of feel horrified by the like, deeply invasive nature of this labor and how dangerous it is and stuff like that. And so Sophie Lewis tries to do this thing that's kind of clever, where she's like, actually, we shouldn't be weirded out by surrogacy. We should be weirded out by pregnancy in general, because pregnancy is like whack,
Preaching to the choir over here.
Yeah, so she kind of like, researches this like medical stuff about how pregnancy is actually just like very bizarre for the body in various ways. And so she tries to kind of like make that the thing. But I think that loses some specificity of like what's specifically worse or different or problematic about surrogacy as a like commodified version,
right,
or like a proletarianized version of this thing that people are doing every day for free anyway. But
so just to, just so our listeners can kind of understand. So, Sam and I have decided to spend all our Patreon money on a designer child. So commercial surrogacy as an activity basically means we can go pay some clinic somewhere, usually not inside the US for various, I assume, legal reasons. And I guess I'm just trying to understand the actual logistics or dynamics of this process, and how is this market actually functioning?
Yeah. So there is a pretty big market for surrogacy within the US, actually. It depends on the state. Each state has different laws. Up until this year, New York prohibited it, but like California has always made it legal. And so the US actually used to be the global sort of leader for this, but then only later some other places started like opening up as like a low cost version, which is like how India sort of blew up. But the difference in price is quite extreme, obviously.
How much of our hard-earned Patreon money are we gonna part with?
Yeah, it could be about $200,000 for doing it within the US.
Jesus, that's almost like a month and a half of Chapo Patreon. How the fuck are we meant to afford that?
Yeah, so generally it's there's a person with sperm basically who wants to have a child that's produced by that sperm, and like you generally will purchase eggs. There are some clients, like consumers of this, who are people who produce like viable ova, but for some reason like can't carry the baby in their womb. So for example, like if you had like a cis woman who had like uterine cancer, and so she had her uterus removed, but she has like viable eggs. But the thing is that if it's like someone who's you know, a bit older or has other problems with fertility, they're usually going to end up getting donated eggs. So I would say that I think it's pretty clear that a majority of the sort of like the purpose of the genetic input is to make a baby that is genetically related to a person with sperm. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But then they'll choose egg donors, usually from, I mean, in the US, they recruit egg donors from like college students. They pay relatively high, you know, compared to some other things. So they try to get like, you know, educated white women, basically. Apparently globally, like eggs from women in Ukraine are really popular because they're like white. But you know, you can imagine that the kind of market for like who wants to be a surrogate and the market for who wants to whose like genetic material is considered most desirable for like purchasing their ova is a little bit different. So yeah, so you get an agency that will help you procure these different things. You get a lawyer to sign a contract with all the parties and the surrogate saying that it's going to be the client's babies. And yeah, that's kind of how it is.
So it seems like, at least for us, this discourse is kind of becoming more common, like the discussion around surrogacy. I don't know if you've noticed this, but like the past few weeks, I've noticed more and more feminists and left-wingers talking about the topic, usually an advocacy for it. And many of them have been using language like, oh, well, if you don't support this, you're transphobic, or you're a Christian, or you're homophobic. And clearly a lot of people, like, well, most of our listeners are gays or trans or bi, so probably not going to have biological children. So this is to them an outlet. But it seems like very similar to the sex work discourse, where these labels of like homophobe and transphobe and like conservative are being weaponized to justify this industry. And she mentions in her book the term bioconservative. Do you think it's out of like good faith, or like what do you think is the mindset behind this? Like, why is she utilizing these kind of slurs if anyone is critical against the labor relations?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's in good faith, but I definitely think is like really dismissive, you know, because she definitely in the book, like she doesn't really engage with the arguments that are made by like people who have opposed commercial surrogacy. So like, you know, I talk about in my review how she kind of misrepresents Black feminist position on it, but it's like, you know, she quotes this scholar, Anita Allen, who's a legal philosopher, and you know, so she kind of like uses one quote that she likes, but you know, the rest of the article has some like really, I think, pretty nuanced and thoughtful proposals for like policy, like how the court should treat these kinds of contracts, basically how we could sort of discourage these kinds of contracts from being entered into, and also protect the rights of the worker in those kinds of situations. And it, you know, it's kind of like, yeah, it's not like, I don't know. I think it's a serious argument that deserves being engaged with. And I just thought in the book, she just kind of like paints everything with a broad brush. And she's just kind of like, oh, if you don't agree with this, then you're like part of this group of bioconservative people or something. Yeah, she doesn't really like take seriously any kind of arguments, or really she doesn't take seriously like left-wing arguments against this. And that's what I think is kind of bizarre, because it's supposedly like a left-wing take.
Yeah, she also mentions the term like neo-imperialist humanitarian feminist as part of the bioconservative sphere. But to me, when I read that, it seems kind of like an oxymoron, because it seems like to support the trade, at least in its current state, comes across as more imperialist than the rejection of that industry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I understand that there's a sort of a certain kind of way that some feminists in like, like the advanced capitalist Western countries or whatever, they sort of focus on the exploitation of like brown women in other countries in a way where it sometimes seems like they're not really acknowledging that this stuff already also happens at home, or there are like, kind of colonialism is a reason why these kinds of there is this massive inequality, or like, I don't know, there's like a kind of background to it that sometimes isn't realized. And I would say like, I actually haven't really like completely delved into that sort of liberal feminist discourse around global surrogacy. So, I'm sure she's probably right that some people kind of have a kind of patronizing take on it, like that wouldn't surprise me. But if it was like a more sort of like a more serious left-wing take, I think we would have to talk about like, like, do we think it's a good thing in the kind of aggregate, or what should we do about the fact that, like rich Europeans are like pawning off their reproductive labor onto like, brown women in the global South. And like, is that something we think is good? Like, obviously I don't think so, so like, I think it's sort of bizarre. Yeah. That,
Well, so, I mean, I wanted to ask a little bit about the relationship between this sort of commercial surrogacy, or maybe surrogacy in general, and some of these sort of family abolition movements. I mean, because the rhetoric sounds superficially similar, which is, and, see if I can reproduce the logic here. It's sort of that, like, clearly the burden of the work of producing children and continuing on the species falls disproportionately on women in almost every society. And sort of barring, was it Engels is like, what do you call it, promiscuous hordes or whatever, where sort of, reproduction is not policed, and where it's sort of, it has usually been concurrent with a sort of male policing of female sexuality and reproduction. But there seems to then be, as sort of, as you say, right, there's a belief that this is sort of just any other kind of labor, and therefore we can just sort of redistribute it, or we can reform that labor relation without sort of any second thought. And yet that sort of seems to be the position of family abolition as well, is to say that, well, by sort of abolishing the family, we can sort of redistribute like domestic labor, say. What's your take on that? Is it the same people advocating for like sort of full surrogacy now, as it were, and those who buy into a lot of the sort of family abolition arguments, or is it a different set?
I think it definitely is the same set. At least Sophie Lewis and like, some of the people that she writes with and, organizes with and stuff. And I don't know. I mean, I think you could make some comparisons to like the wages for housework demand, because there's a way in which it's like, okay, mostly it's women or, people with wombs who are doing a lot of this, particular kind of like reproductive labor, or who are doing more of the housework, or like, things like that. And so there's this kind of demand that's like, well, we want that labor to be recognized as being, important, and also it should be paid. And that's sort of a way that's like a demand that the wages for housework kind of, and I think Lewis was explicitly inspired by that. But I think, there even were critiques of wages for housework, even at the time that it first came out, or like, I think Angela Davis even has an article critiquing it. But, it kind of raises the issue of like, well, number one, does anyone really want to be paid like a wage by their spouse for doing housework? Like, that sounds horrible, right? Like, unless you guys feel otherwise, but I think it's
agree.
like,
No, I was just trying to think of the logistics of that. I'm still not going to do housework.
Yeah, it's just kind of like, it's like, I don't know, kind of making the transactional nature of it like sort of worse, where I feel like feminist demands generally have been around like, we want men to like share in this labor, not like, just like pay us for it. You know what I mean? I think, at least. And, I think sometimes there's a way in which, like, you could make some version of that demand. Like, for example, if we had a universal basic income, or we had, like, some kind of social wage that could sort of be arguably providing some kind of compensation, or not really compensation, but support, for people to do this kind of unwaged work, right? But I think that is like a different kind of demand that doesn't involve sort of commodifying it in this like hyper transactional way that I think it would be if you're, like, for example, paying someone to carry a baby for you, or to like clean your house or something like that, whether that person is, your partner, or like a maid that you hire. I think, like, generally we want a kind of more I think we can have demands and ways of framing these things where we want this kind of labor to be recognized and to be, like, supported by society without having it be, like, commodified in this way. So that's where I think this discourse sometimes is a little bit confusing, because I'm not sure that, like, the family abolitionists would never necessarily say that is what they want, but it's not clear that, like, they're not distinguishing it from this. And, like, with the surrogacy thing, it's kind of at a policy level there, like, Lewis is okay with legalizing commercial surrogacy. So yeah,
it seems, like there is a difference in kind, and certainly thinking back to our interview with Esperanza about sex work specifically and the sex trade, there does seem to be something slightly different in kind, where the product is in fact your body, right? I mean, as opposed to perhaps your labor, even in the case of something like domestic labor, which is, yes, massively undercompensated, and there are plenty of good critiques of those structures that lead to that. But is there something different going on when the fact that, like, the product you are selling that is being commodified is literally sort of full dominion and use of your body?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think, I said this in one of the response pieces that I wrote. It's like, I think that there can be, some value to showing how different kinds of labor are similar in certain ways. Like, there's different kinds of domestic or social reproductive labor, some of which involve the body in a more direct way and some of which don't, but, like, it's all, connected in various ways. And I think that, showing how different kinds of labor are similar can help build solidarity and help, it helps us, with our Marxist analysis, because we're showing that, like, these are similar in certain ways. But at the same time, I think, like, each kind of labor is also different. And it seems it's like silly to try to say that there's no difference between this kind of labor and some other kinds of labor that don't involve, like, putting things inside your vagina or in your uterus. You know what I mean? It's just like, and if you look at some of the specifics, like, for example, how surrogacy laws in the US, for example, like, sort of interact with sort of bodily autonomy protections that, like, people normally have. So, for example, like, there's no other situation, like, normally, like, a person, a woman who's pregnant, or whoever who's pregnant, has the right to pick their own doctor, right? Or to pick whether they want to get an abortion, or to pick whether, I mean, obviously some states restrict abortion, but it's not like you have to get your boss's permission to get an abortion, right? But, like, or your husband's permission, right? But, like, the, state laws that legalize surrogacy, some of them even allow the, like, the client parents to choose the doctor, to make various medical decisions, like, in their interest, not in the surrogate's choice. I mean, there have been a couple of high profile sort of legal fights where a surrogate where she refused to get an abortion that the client parents wanted them to, because sometimes the client parents will want the surrogate to abort the fetus if it's, like, has a disability, or if there's, like, multiples and they only want a certain number. So, they're like, generally they can't prevent the surrogate from getting an abortion if she wants to, because Roe v. Wade gives that decision to her, but they can actually like have legal consequences for her declining to get an abortion that she doesn't want to get. So like in California, that's totally legal for these contracts to restrict her rights. So it's like, yeah, there's just no other job in which like your employment contracts says that you have to get an abortion that you don't want. You know what I mean? Like it's obviously like specific to this type of work that involves like quite significant intrusions into bodily autonomy that, require, I think, having like a lot more sensitivity into thinking about like how or whether we want this to be a type of work that people are doing.
So you wrote your initial review. It came out a couple months ago. It's not so long ago, right? And clearly it's a topic that is going to inflame passions because it intersects perfectly with, notions of family, child rearing, and intersects with abortion and the labor relations. It's kind of the perfect storm. You got some pushback, and this turned into quite the correspondence. Tell us a little bit about what was the pushback you were getting, and how did that progress?
Well, before, so I got a response was written by another author in New Politics, and so we had like 2 exchanges, and part of the response, I'm not sure if I can summarize them super effectively, but the kind of like, well, it's really important to recognize that this is labor, and that, by my saying that this shouldn't be a job that we are encouraging people to have through our public policy, that like somehow I'm like denying the importance of this kind of labor, or like preventing these kinds of workers from organizing. And, I tried to make it really clear that like, I think, if workers are already doing this work, we should support their organizing. I think that's fine. I wouldn't be like, if the surrogates in some place were like, we're going to form a union, I would say, cool, you should form a union. But on the other hand, when it comes to like economic policy, we're like, sometimes there's this argument that's like, well, if that's the type of work that they want to do, we should support their sort of individual choice. But I think that, when you start getting into those kinds of lines of argument, it ultimately becomes like much more of a neoliberal type argument and not really a leftist one, because I don't think that leftists ever really support workers' sort of right to work in a specific job of their own choosing if there's some countervailing reason why we think that that job is like, not good for the environment or not good for society in some kind of broader way, So I tried to kind of talk about like why basically how our economic policies should be like encouraging job growth in areas that we think are sort of like meaningful and socially useful types of work, and not types of labor that are, especially exploitative or especially like bad for the environment, or particularly, harmful in other ways. So that was one kind of argument I had. I mean, I had a lot of pushback on like Facebook with like some friends of friends who, I think some people just were kind of like, honestly, just kind of like, if you're anti-surrogacy, like, unless you, like, I don't know, this whole thing, just like, they just were insisting that like something, like some kind of unclear relationship that they weren't spelling out, this somehow meant that I was like, anti, sex workers and anti
my body, my choice.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, but it's like, I kind of understand the analogy with sex work. I think that there are differences, and we could talk about that if you want, but the whole connection to like how this has to do with trans rights. It's like, I consider myself a trans ally, and like, there are certain reasons why like certain radical feminists sort of are opposed to both of these things, but that doesn't mean that like that's the reason that I'm opposing it. You know what I mean? Like, it's just that you can like have a like overlap in your politics with like organizations and people that you disagree with them on like very many other things. And
we wouldn't know anything about that.
No.
We clearly co-sign the opinions of everybody we've ever overlapped, even incidentally, in an opinion with.
Yeah.
So you have a really good quote in your piece. You say, Lewis mistakenly equates a pro-worker desire for the decriminalization of labor with a pro-business demand for legalization of for-profit industry. And it seems to be like there's a lot of parallels between that and sex work, where people conflate being pro like the worker with like being pro the industry. I guess, how do you combat that? I know like in the sex work world, like people used to call it swerve, but what is it like for like like people calling out surrogacy? Like what is
is it like to be anti the surrogacy industry?
Well, I mean, I think that it requires like, it's going to require some political education, you know, like I brought this issue up with my DSA chapter because there was actually a New York State law that was being proposed to legalize surrogacy. And I went to the Social Femme Working Group and I was like, I think we should be opposed to this law, you know, and a lot of people were like, just not familiar, you know, they just felt like they didn't know enough about it. And I think, yeah, I mean, New York DSA is also doing some work around like decriminalizing sex work. And I think there's a way in which like the kind of rhetoric of these two things kind of don't line up exactly. But I still think that like, you know, I ended up doing a teach-in on the issue for folks in the organization. And I think, you know, people learned from that. And I think like if you really get into it more, you can sort of make some distinction. So one of the things that, you know, I think is a pretty critical distinction between surrogacy and sex work is that sex work is generally like happening even where it's banned. So there's this idea that we should like decriminalize it because these workers are like being subject to like criminalization, you know, like whereas surrogacy, you know, of course, the research that I've done really doesn't indicate that there's much of a black market for surrogacy in states like New York where it was banned, right? Because, you know, sex work is easier to like do in a alleyway or in your house or whatever. Surrogacy requires like doctors and you have to get, you know, paperwork for like the transfer of like parental rights and stuff like that. And it's just like, it's much more complicated and it's also extremely expensive. And so like, I think people who are, you know, wanting to be clients of this, like they want it to be like a legally enforceable contract. So they'll go to a place where they can get that, you know? And so I think there isn't really a harm reduction argument for legalizing surrogacy, right? Because there aren't like currently workers that are doing this, but on an underground level. There was some, like Lewis talks in her book about a couple examples of like when India tried to institute this ban, they like basically some doctors who had clinics set up for surrogacy in India, they were flying in women from like other countries and like implanting embryos in them and then having them give birth in other countries so that like that was a way of technically flouting the ban. And I do think that that's like a serious thing that we should be concerned about. I think, you know, I'm not in India, so I don't have like all the latest on like what people on the ground there think is the sort of best way to go about doing this. But I think that it kind of shows in a way that, you know, capitalist businesses are generally harder to shut down once they are built up. You know, they invest a bunch of capital in this thing. And so they're going to want to flout any kind of like new ban. I mean, we've seen that with like health insurance in the US, for example. That's like our biggest enemy. So I think like, you know, really preventing capital from building up their investments in like certain areas that we don't want them to get a hold in is really critical. So, you know, yeah, like a place like New York that just doesn't have a surrogacy industry, I think the goal should just be to make sure we don't start one. But
and that front, I mean, it's just because, I mean, it's a really interesting point you make to say that, yeah, it's sort of there's a capital interest in the established industries, And is it fair to say that many of the buyers of these services are wealthier, right? I mean, they can presumably afford to pay for all of this. And do you see a public policy solution for this, maybe the states in the US that do have established surrogacy industries?
I mean, I think that it's going to require like a multi-pronged kind of struggle. I think that anywhere that has surrogacy, we can try to improve the working conditions. I think we can also try to ban it, honestly. And I think it would be, like the kinds of things I was talking about that happened in India when they implemented a ban. You would want to be kind of careful and try to figure out ways that you could make sure that it doesn't go underground in this way. I think it's not super easy to do, but I think it would take some research, but I think part of the struggle also has to be ideological, right? Because like we need to be critiquing the kind of the like upper class consumers of this type of product. And we have all this, a lot of like wealthy celebrities who have, been interviewed about, how they use the surrogate, like Kim Kardashian and Sarah Michelle, what is her name? Not Sarah Michelle Gellar, Sarah Jessica Parker. The media coverage has been like really fawning in a way, like super supportive.
Elton John, I think, as well, famously.
Yeah. And honestly, I don't think that it's necessarily super productive for the left to be like getting too into the like police, like, individuals, like you individually did this thing and you're terrible. I mean, I think that's not really the point of a lot of our analysis, but I do think like, like we can raise questions about why is it that, we have this system where like people who are rich can just like choose to forego the labor of pregnancy. And do we really think that's like a good thing? I mean, it seems like extremely obvious from like a kind of materialist feminist perspective that it's like increasing like the hierarchy, like the divergent sort of hierarchy among women rather than like advancing women's rights as a whole, right? Because to the extent that like, more and more women will, who are, have busy jobs and careers will choose to do this because they don't have time, right? Like that's just continuing to perpetuate the fact that we don't have any fucking family leave in this country and like, have this like workplaces that are very unfriendly to parenting. And yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, some of the people who serve as surrogates in the US, there's a lot of like military wives and like white Christian housewives and different kind of things like that. And it's almost like they're kind of choosing to make their like gestation is their thing that they're doing. And then other women are doing the work, and in the office, like, yeah. And well, exactly. I mean, like it's fine for people to have choices, but these are clearly not like choices that are, being made in a kind of free way, right? Like they're being very conditioned by the capitalist and sexist market. So
that's a great point. I mean, I used to live in Denmark for many years, and what was always fascinating to me is I was a irresponsible 20-something gay boy in a strange land. So I wasn't no children on my brain, but the number of people who are my contemporaries who became parents, and the Danish fertility rate is considered very high. Why? Because they have amazing parental leave and amazing sort of benefits for people who do have children. And so, yeah, it is sort of interesting, as you say, that they're like, it's too easy to conflate maybe some of the aspects of surrogacy that are really about people who desperately want children and cannot, versus maybe just a commodified market or a sort of like, well, in this labor market, you can just trade off, the inconvenience of pregnancy for success in your career or whatever, and like, good on you.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, that is a relatively small, like the kind of people who are doing it by choice, like they don't have any medical reason, is relatively small, but it is increasing from the limited studies that I've read. So there's no reason to think it wouldn't continue in that direction.
So there's another piece or part of the piece that you wrote which brought up a lot of language that to me just comes across as like very alienated and like Orwellian, where it's like gestational workers, an open source, fully collaborative gestation, and utopian gestational commune.
Hot. I think I've seen that Pornhub category. That's some weird shit.
Do you think this is kind of reinforcing like patriarchal values in like a new kind of like bourgeois feminist sort of way, where it's kind of treating women's uteruses as like production sites versus like places where you raise like your children and stuff?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, in the book, she has these kind of utopian language, but it's not very spelled out what she means by that. So it could kind of go in a bunch of different directions. But definitely when I read some of those things, it's kind of like, doesn't necessarily sound appealing to me. I mean, it could go in some directions that are like very negative, in my opinion. Like, yeah, I think that I'm not thinking of a quote right now, but she kind of talks about this idea that like, the children would belong to all of the people in society and not to a specific person.
It takes a village,
Yeah, but it's a little more extreme.
way more than that.
Yeah. And there's a way that I think that that kind of doesn't necessarily fully take into consideration like the kind of uniquely personal nature of this type of labor, and also especially like the history of like the state taking away kids from like Native women and Black women and stuff like that. I just think there's a way that feminisms, especially for women of color, like working class women of color, have sort of tended to want to like protect that bond, or to say that like, for example, that that the bio mom has some kind of like specific rights to have a relationship with a child that are kind of special, and it's like I don't think that is necessarily completely inconsistent with ideas of like it takes a village, but I do think it's it could like, depending on the version, like it you wouldn't want some kind of like weird communist state thing where they're like, oh, you have to raise your baby in the dormitory, like on the kibbutz or whatever, and like
baby bread lines.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just like I'm not sure. I think there's ways in which like if your womb or if your child, it belongs to the collective and not to you individually, that could be very dystopian for a lot of people. You know what I mean? I think like a lot of people want their bodies and also their children to sort of be a little bit more specifically under their own sort of autonomous control. And I think that has to be balanced with children's rights, because, children have a right to be like autonomous from their parents to a certain extent, but maybe not like all the way 100%. Like those are things that we have to figure out how to balance. And I'm not sure where that politics in like Sophie Lewis would try to put that balance, but it's not really addressed in the book, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like, I mean, if you're thinking about some of these notions you were sort of referencing about the loss of multi-generational families, and the idea that often, in many societies not so long ago, the idea that maybe, mothers would help their daughters through pregnancy and childbirth and child rearing, and that you'd have multi-generational households or multi-family households where, yes, there's a communalism to that. And that's something very special. However, a reaction against alienation, and the alienation of like, hello, consumer number, 1247, you've been assigned childbirth bay 3. It doesn't seem like a very healthy reaction to then say, no, what we really need here is a marketplace. Like that doesn't seem to be pushing back, the alienation, the frontier of alienation from, yes, what is deeply a personal thing. I mean, and I say this as a gay man who's not really very intimately involved in this process, except to say, clearly it's something that to many people is very precious, and clearly we know even from a sort of materially grounded perspective sets the trajectory of people's lives, and so the idea that you would sort of cede that to a profit motive does seem ugly on its face, right? Even if the reasons might be all very good and altruistic or grounded in a sound theoretical basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think so.
So you touched on this a little earlier, the surrogacy being like a big industry in places like India. I know Thailand's also a really big place, but I think within like the last year or so, both have heavily restricted or banned foreigners from purchasing these industries. Did her book kind of address the like imperialist aspects? I know for sex work as well, like Esperanza's piece, which I know you've listened to the episode, I believe, talks about how there's this kind of hierarchy within the industry of like the more well-off Western like sex worker surrogate, but then you have like the third world, which is, and it's a big market for Western and European parents to just distribute their child off to like a poor Thai or Indian woman. Did she address this issue, or is she kind of like skimp over it? And like, what is your thoughts on all of this?
I mean, she does talk about the kind of globally stratified nature of it, I think, a bit. And yeah, I think that it's interesting what's been happening with some of these countries, because like, you know, I was talking about earlier, like India legalized surrogacy, but then banned it. And I think Thailand and Cambodia did the same thing. And it's, you know, there's something I think about like the optics for, I mean, this is my impression from, you know, just reading about it in the news, that like the optics of, you know, having these Europeans coming to like use the bodies of, you know, women in those countries was like not appealing to the left in those countries. It was also not appealing to the, you know, conservatives. So it kind of like had some pushback on like multiple levels. And I would say, by the way, in some, like I did read about in Cambodia, there were, when they banned surrogacy, they did actually threaten the women themselves with criminal sanctions, and they basically forced them to keep the babies. These were mostly, I think, commissioning like client parents from China. And yeah, I mean, I think that like, so when people talk about like, I mean, I don't want to be too strong in terms of like saying that, you know, criminalization is like not a thing. I think it's not a thing that is happening in a place like the US. And and there's also like pretty easy ways to make that not happen. Like you could pass a law and have it, you know, not taken effect until like a certain amount in the future. You know what I mean? So there's no reason why trying to legally restrict surrogacy would have to mean like these kinds of like punitive consequences on the workers themselves who are already involved in this industry. But that is something that has happened like a little bit in some other places like Cambodia. So I think like, you know, it's interesting. I mean, and the US, if you sort of look at the global trend, it is, I think, becoming illegal more places. It's illegal in most of Europe. Now it's illegal in China and a bunch of countries in Asia. So yeah, I don't know. I think like, you know, the US generally has a more sort of laissez-faire type of approach towards technology and a lot of things, towards the market in general. So it's not surprising that we have that here. But I think it's kind of remains to be seen like a little bit what direction it might take.
Well, it's okay. In California, we've just done Prop 22, which means you can order a baby on an app, and you don't have to. The company doesn't have to provide health benefits to the mother. It's great.
I you know, since this is a a podcast oriented towards the LGBT community, I do want to mention that some of these bans in some other countries have specifically been like targeting gay men, like saying like,
thank goodness.
Gay men shouldn't be able to do this, but some straight couples can. So like, obviously that's not good.
Yeah. So you mentioned how Europe has like very high rates of like prohibitions on commercial surrogacy. It's actually like the U.S. is one of the few countries it seems that actually allows this industry to thrive. But I think it was a year or two ago, the European Court of Human Rights ruled 2017 against surrogacy, and they basically linked it to human trafficking after a case of an Italian couple trying to purchase a non-genetically aligned Russian surrogate's child. So it's like just like her baby, but not their DNA or anything. What is your thoughts on like kind of, but like what are your thoughts on this like parallel between like human trafficking? This is they try to deny it's like the baby being sold, but it kind of is the baby being the market product in the end. Like what do you equate that to market or human trafficking at all, or like what is your thoughts on that parallel, like the association?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely selling a baby. I mean, I think there's no doubt about it. It's obviously, you're not selling a baby so that you can have it as your like in-house free labor. So it's, like, it's not
like Gia Tolentino over here. God.
Yeah, it's not slavery, and that's good. But I think when it, like, maybe I'm being a little bit too much of like a lawyer nerd about it, but I do think that like there is a, when it comes to like the law, like slavery is the reason why we're concerned about any kind of commodification of human life that's like upheld by the law, right? And so like, like when you're saying that this baby belongs to this parent because that parent paid money for it, not because, that's the parent that's been like caring for it thus far, or that's the parent that's, genetically related, or any other reason, it's because they paid for it. Like that's definitely kind of like selling a person, and that's obviously not a good thing. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it does. If you look globally, I mean, I think there are like, it does involve like a global transfer of like people across borders for commercial purposes. So yeah, I don't know.
So as you're clearly aware, we're homosexualists. We hide it very well, I know, but within sort of the LGBT community, particularly among gay men and lesbians and things like that, there has been historically a very long trend of those who maybe wish to have children engaging in certain kinds of transactional affairs that are around, essentially, maybe we would have sort of broadly called like altruistic surrogacy, right? There's not money changing hands in a commercial transaction, but it results still in a transfer of a human baby at some point, in some form. How Sweden repeatedly has
banned all surrogacy.
That, right? Even that's kind. What's your take on this? I mean, because clearly there are plenty of people who do not have the capacity to have a baby, maybe because of their same-sex partnership and things like that. What's your take on that versus commercial surrogacy?
Yeah, well, I think as like a socialist, my main concern is with the capitalist like commercial version. You know what I mean? I think what people do in their personal lives is really not that big of a deal, and we should generally favor like freedom in those areas. I do think that, I guess, my sort of personal like politics or my analysis of surrogacy specifically, I do think that, like, for example, altruistic surrogacy contracts should also not be enforceable. So for example, like if I had a gay friend and I agreed to like, carry a baby for that friend, but then I changed my mind, I still think I should have the right to change my mind, regardless of whether it's a commercial transaction or not, because I think that the kind of, like the uniquely intimate nature of pregnancy, if I have like some kind of like attachment to this child that develops during those 9 months or whatever, I think that that should be respected. But that doesn't mean that the other parent, like the gay friend, shouldn't have any rights to like be a parent to the child, right? Like I think you can share custody in those kinds of circumstances. The point is just that I don't think he should have the right to like take it away from her if she wants to do that. And I think there has like Lewis and I think some other people, there's another writer who has raised some concerns about altruistic surrogacy, like in India, that it could be done, like used in oppressive ways, or like where like wealthier family members or something pressure someone in their family to do this. And I think that that's something that we should be concerned about. I don't really see that as being like something that would be super widespread here. But yeah, I mean, I think that generally we want to be, I think it's good to be like thinking about expansive ways for people to form families, and some kind of like thing like surrogacy could be a part of that, as long as we're respecting the rights of the surrogate and the baby.
So I mean, just because you are a lawyer, I mean,
not yet. I haven't been admitted yet.
Oh shit! When is that happening?
Oh, I have to find out about the bar. I just
God.
Last one.
COVID bar. Well, we're rooting for you because we need a legal we need legal representation for this podcast. Given how often we slander Gia Tolentino.
Oh God.
But so just to kind of understand, like, so that objection is around the enforceability of those contracts. So theoretically, if we were waving our magic wand in these kinds of altruistic situations where it is like, a woman and her gay BFF, come to some understanding, but the structure at the moment is somebody might sign a contract. And so we could wave our magic wand and simply say, you know what, those contracts are not enforceable, in the same way that like California makes a bunch of types of employment contracts unenforceable. And that's kind of seems like a good way to essentially empower workers to change their minds and to not be beholden to employers. Would you be in favor of like that kind of reform?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Seems kind of reasonable, right?
So I feel like within this discourse, there's a lot of like contradictions of like interest and like all things in society. But clearly, like I know when I was reading about the Sweden case of like banning all surrogacy, their case studies were of UK people doing black market payments to do like, it's altruistic surrogacy, which like makes sense. I mean, these are rich people who are trying to buy a baby. But I guess like there seems to be a contradiction for people like who like gays and like trans people who want to have babies but can't themselves, potentially trying to override women's bodily autonomy. And my belief is like the woman's individual autonomy matters more than like someone else's like right to have a baby. But I guess like how do we guarantee, like, you might have the answer to this, like how do we ensure gays can have the right to babies but also like not rely on a system of like adoption, because that relies on like problematic parents in the first place. Like is there a possibility to have surrogacy or something like that allows gays to have babies without like relying on like shitty families to give up their children as well? Like, so that's a really like
that was a strange phrasing, Sam.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
What is that? Shitty families? Wow.
Well, that's why they're taken away.
No, so you're talking about it in the adoption case.
Yeah, that's the only other option none for gays. That's what I'm trying to get asking. It's like,
sure, 2 bottles of Merlot and a bar. Okay.
I mean, or people voluntarily give away their
right,
because they can't raise it.
Right, and so maybe what we're then talking about is if
that's my scatterbrain.
Yeah, that was
a question. It's like,
no, I saw where you were going with it. I think I can rephrase. Sorry, my client doesn't know what he's saying.
Sorry.
So to the extent that there is a hierarchy of the degree of state involvement and potential sort of labor relation coercion in these things, right? I mean, there's everything from somebody saying, this is something I really want to do because I think it's whatever, like whatever the reasoning is. I think it's fun. I think it's good. I think it's, a good thing to do. All the way through to, I have literally no other options in my life except perhaps survival sex work. And so within that hierarchy, I mean, do you think we in the US have any chance of, I mean, we're only exposed to maybe certain kinds of it are at risk of supporting tacitly or explicitly sort of certain kinds of it. But do you think there's a, like what should we be looking out for, and where should we be spending our energy if we're kind of worried about this as an issue, but still think that maybe some people should be able to have babies that don't come out of their bodies?
Yeah. Well, so just on I do think it's interesting and worth kind of talking about this issue of like, is there a right to have a baby, right? Because that's something that the like LGBT groups that are advocating for this, they do use that language of rights. Personally, I don't think that at this point there can be or should be a right to have a baby, because it's like, at least if the baby is not coming out of your body, you know what I mean? Because then it means like involving someone else's body. And that's sort of like there was one piece that I read where the author was just saying like there can't be a right to someone else's body. And so I think like that's a good way to think about it. But I do think we should be trying to like expand the possibilities for people to have kids, even if they don't have the, biological apparatus to do so. And honestly, it's not like there's like a really easy answer to it. I mean, I think obviously maybe one day we'll have like machines that can be like artificial wombs, and then that would be fine, I guess. We're not, as long as the machines aren't sentient, it's cool. But, in the meantime, I think that there isn't sort of like a quick fix, and so that does make this kind of harder, because there are going to be like a certain amount of people who really, really want this, and they want it like soon within their lifetime, that kind of thing, and so that's a tough thing to sort of like politically struggle against, I guess.
Well, it's very simple. I'll trade you a lightly used kidney for a baby.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think that we need to be figuring out more ways to support all kinds of people to have kids, I think like in terms of like family leave and things like that. And I think that there's probably I'm not super knowledgeable about this area of law, but I think there's probably some ways that the law could be changed to like better recognize non-traditional family structures. And that could, not just be like LGBT couples who want to have a kid, but it might be like you have, the gay uncle who's like a official part of the family, not just like sort of someone who has no sort of recognition as being like a family member. You know what I mean? So I think there's some ways that kind of thing could be facilitated more.
Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We are really appreciate that you've informed us on this. And so we want to make sure people can find you and more of you. But also you are, as you mentioned, going to be on the labor market as a labor lawyer soon. And I don't know if you know about our ongoing case against River Page, our one Twink Revolution employee who keeps making bad, problematic tweets. Yeah. We may be procuring your services soon. And if you happen to be in a position to hire labor lawyers shortly, Alex is our favorite labor lawyer. So make sure you are favorite almost labor lawyer. So make sure you hire her, everybody. Alex, where do people find more of you and your writings and your content?
So, I mean, I'm on Twitter. I will say I'm extremely not active on Twitter, but you can follow me and You can, the articles that we were talking about here are in the magazine New Politics. So that's like newpol.org, I believe.
We'll link them.
Yeah, we'll link all that in the episode description.
And I think that's good.
That's where you are? Yeah, good.
Yeah.
What are you working on next?
Yeah, so I actually am trying to work on a piece that's kind of comparing surrogacy and sex work and marijuana legalization and some other kind of situations, because I want to kind of think about basically how the left should think about these kinds of newly emerging markets in like things that were previously prohibited, and sort of how we can go about like supporting workers without accidentally like supporting business owners or industries, and sort of how we can think about like commodification and where we should try to draw those lines. So it's like, I'm not sure where I'm going to try to place it, but that's my next sort of goal of like something that I want to write about.
Well, apropos of nothing, if you're not familiar with the twinkrev.com publication, always a great place to... Alex, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks all for listening. See you next time.
Thanks, guys.